Hello, welcome to the National Road Heritage Corridor's Heritage Stewards Academy. I'm Jen Burden, Director of Cultural Resources for the National Road. In this episode, Angelique Bamberg of Clio Consulting explains the Federal Historic Preservation Incentives Program, as well as Pennsylvania's Historic Preservation Tax Credit Program. These programs can provide tax credits to owners of certified historic buildings to rehabilitate them for income-producing purposes.
My name is Angelique Bamberg. I'm a historic preservation consultant in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My firm, Clio Consulting LLC, specializes in helping businesses, nonprofits, and property owners with historic resource surveys, National Register of Historic Places nominations, and historic rehabilitation tax credit applications. All of these are closely linked, as we'll see. One project I'm very proud to have worked on is the listing of downtown Washington in the National Register as the Washington Commercial Historic District. This historic district listing makes many buildings in downtown Washington eligible for the historic tax credit, which is a great benefit to property owners and developers. Across the state and the country, thousands of other historic districts confer the same benefit, and many more historic buildings outside of historic districts are also eligible for the credit because they're individually listed in the National Register. In this presentation, I'm going to give an introduction to the Historic Rehabilitation Tax Credit Program. I'll explain how it works and how it can benefit the owners of historic properties who want to rehabilitate their buildings for income-producing uses. The Historic Rehabilitation Tax Credit is a joint program between state and federal historic preservation agencies and the Internal Revenue Service. To be clear, my expertise is on the historic preservation rules, regulations, and process pertaining to the credit. There are, of course, many IRS regulations on the financial side of the credit. I'm going to put some helpful links about those in the resources slide at the end of this presentation, but I'm going to focus today on what I know, which is the preservation side of the program. I'm not a tax professional, so I always advise my clients to consult their tax professional and, if possible, their legal counsel to make sure the program will be of value to them before they invest time, effort, and expense in the application. To briefly go over some basics. The Historic Rehabilitation Tax Credit is a federal program that was introduced by Congress in the 1970s as part of the surge of interest in historic preservation around the nation's bicentennial. Its purpose is to provide an incentive to preserve and reuse historic buildings as a viable alternative to tearing them down and replacing them. It awards the owners of certified historic structures a credit equal to 20% of qualified rehabilitation expenses against their income tax, and we'll define those terms as we go along. So as a simple example, for a qualified rehabilitation that cost $1 million, the IRS will credit the owner entity $200,000 against their income tax obligation. There is a financial market for these credits, so some owners will syndicate the credit as part of their plan for financing their rehabilitation project. State Historic Preservation offices coordinate the program on the local level in each state and serve as liaisons between local applicants and the National Park Service at the federal level. What are qualified rehabilitation expenses? In general, QREs are anything that is integral to the historic building and related to its operation and maintenance. So its structure, its envelope, materials, building systems, and finishes. Many soft rehabilitation costs qualify as well, including architects and engineering fees. QREs do not include costs related to building acquisition, demolition, or expansion, such as new additions, site work, such as parking, landscape, sidewalks, or signage, or furnishings, appliances, or anything that is not a permanent part of the building. What makes a property eligible for the historic tax credit? First, it needs to be a certified historic structure. This means it is either a National Historic Landmark, individually listed in the National Register of Historic Places, or it contributes to a National Register listed historic district. How do you know if your property is one of these? The State Historic Preservation Office maintains these records. You can look your property up on its online info sharing program, PA Share, by making a free account and using the search function. For example, here on this slide, I'm displaying the PA Share screen for the Washington Commercial Historic District. It shows a map of the district boundaries so you can see if your property is in or out. All addresses that are within the district will also be listed in an official inventory that will note the contributing or non-contributing status of each one. Briefly, contributing means a building is recognizable as being from the period of significance of the district. In Washington, that's a very long time span, beginning in 1788 and ending in 1945. Contributing also means buildings are related to the district's historical areas of significance. In Washington's case, these are commerce and architecture. Second, the rehabilitation must be a certified rehabilitation. That means it needs to meet the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties, and I'll say more about that later. Third, the property must be income producing. The program cannot be used for owner-occupied single-family homes. And the applicant must have an income tax obligation against which to apply the credit, or an investor who does. There are ways for nonprofits to avail themselves of the credit by spinning off or affiliating with a for-profit entity. 501c3 organizations entertaining this option will definitely want to consult with their financial and legal counsels about exactly how this can work for them. Fourth, the rehabilitation must meet something called the substantial rehabilitation test. This ensures that the program is used to offset relatively major work and keeps the program staff from being inundated with applications for minor repairs and routine maintenance. QREs are calculated within a measuring period of 24 months for an unphased project or 60 months for complex projects that are completed in phases. If you're unsure which fits your project, there's much more information on this that is outside the scope of this presentation to help you decide. And again, I'll put resources for further info in the last slide. For now, the last point I want to mention about eligibility for the credit is that not being already listed in the National Register is not necessarily disqualifying. That's because the National Register is never complete and we're always adding new resources all the time. So if you have a building that is not listed now, but is eligible for listing, it is possible for the two applications, the Historic Tax Credit application and the National Register nomination, to proceed concurrently. Definitely talk to your state historic preservation office if this is your situation. For example, the Washington Commercial Historic District had not yet been listed in the National Register when the owners of the Washington Trust building planned to rehabilitate it. So the owner simultaneously nominated the building individually to the National Register and applied for the Historic Rehabilitation Tax Credit. Both efforts were successful and the project received the tax credit. A few years later, the Washington Commercial Historic District was listed in the National Register. This made all of the contributing historic buildings within the district boundaries eligible for the credit all at once. Now they don't have to be individually nominated and listed, but they do have to go through the application process to be certified historic structures. The Historic Tax Credit application consists of 3 parts called straightforwardly enough Part 1, Part 2, and Part 3. You will submit each part first to the State Historic Preservation Office. If you're in Pennsylvania, you will do this again through their online info exchange portal, PA Share. The SHPO staff will conduct an initial review, provide comments, and forward your application to the National Park Service. Staff at the National Park Service conducts the definitive review and issues an official decision on each part of the application. Each part may be amended as needed to provide additional information or to update plans if the project changes along the way, as many do. There is a review time of 30 days at each agency for each submission. Now let's go through each part. Part 1, Evaluation of Significance. The purpose of Part 1 is to verify that your building is a certified historic structure under the regulations of the program. Buildings that are National Historic Landmarks or individually listed in the National Register of Historic Places are automatically certified historic structures. You do not have to complete a Part 1 for a National Historic Landmark or an individually listed building. You do have to complete Part 1 for a contributing building within a listed historic district or for a building that is not listed in the National Register yet, such as in the previous Washington Trust building example. Part 1 consists of an application form, brief narratives describing the building's physical appearance and historical significance, exterior and interior photographs of the building to document its before condition, a site plan that is keyed to the exterior photos showing the position and the direction of the camera for each image, floor plans that are keyed to the locations and views of the interior photos, and a map or satellite view showing the building's location. When I'm compiling a Part 1, I try to think of a person who's sitting in an office in Washington, D.C., who may or may not have ever been to my city, and orienting them to the building in the community, giving them a virtual tour outside and inside of it with photographs. Part 2 is the meat of the Historic Tax Credit application. It explains exactly what you plan to do to rehabilitate the building and how you plan to do it. The main components of Part 2 are an application form or cover sheet, plans, and a narrative that goes feature by feature throughout the building with space to describe the existing condition and the proposed rehabilitation treatment for each. All buildings are different, so some will have historically significant materials, ornament, or design features, and on the interior, historic spaces such as lobbies, classrooms, showrooms, offices, meeting rooms, etc., that will all need to be called out and described in terms of their adaptive reuse. For all buildings, you'll need to address basic features like the exterior envelope, windows, floor plan, vertical circulation, interior finishes, and so forth. If additional photographs are needed to illustrate building conditions that weren't shown in Part 1 or weren't shown in enough detail, you can include those with Part 2 as well. It is highly advised to have an architect who is familiar with the Secretary of the Interior standards and the Historic Tax Credit Program draw up the plans. They will be knowledgeable about the expectations of the program, the level of detail required, and how to meet the Secretary of the Interior standards, which I'll talk about in the next slide. I think of the narrative component as a kind of caption to the plans. The plans show in black and white what you intend to do. The narrative gives you the opportunity to explain why you made the choices you made, the building's constraints and opportunities, how proposed changes relate to the new use, how you reconciled modern code requirements with the historic design, or whatever the specific circumstances may be. Ultimately, the narrative explains how your rehabilitation meets the Secretary of the Interior standards and where you could not meet them in an ideal fashion, why not, and what you are proposing as your best alternative. The Secretary of the Interior standards are a general set of guidelines for best preservation practices for respecting the historic fabric and character-defining features of historic buildings. To go through them in detail would be another whole presentation, so here I'll just say that the intention is to provide a flexible framework so that historic buildings can be adapted to new uses without losing the characteristics that make them eligible for the National Register. Together, their message can be summed up as being similar to the Hippocratic Oath: first, do no harm. The standards prescribe a conservative approach of retaining and repairing historic materials, forms, and features before replacing them wherever possible, and then if replacement becomes the only option, documenting the extent of damage or deterioration of the old, and matching the historic design, dimensions, texture, and other visual qualities as closely as possible with the new. For example, water damage has left this hardwood floor in a historic school building in such poor condition that it would be impossible to refinish it. The standards would permit the installation of a new wood floor to match the old in dimensions, color, and grain, but they would not permit replacing the floor with carpet or other flooring. Luxury vinyl plank would also not be an appropriate replacement because its visual qualities, especially the dimensions of its planks, do not match those of historic hardwood floorboards. The same building has a terracotta tile roof that is one of its character-defining features. It is damage to the roof that has caused the water leakage that ruined the floors, so clearly some action to address the roof is necessary. The standards would permit this roof to be repaired through the replacement of individual missing or damaged tiles or the replacement of the entire roof with identical terracotta tiles. A substitute material with the same color, texture, and other visual qualities might be approved, but an asphalt shingle roof would not have the same qualities, so it would not meet the standards. As far as possible, the standards encourage working within the historic building forms and floor plans. Sometimes additions are necessary to provide for new uses or code-required features, such as accessibility, a second staircase, or an elevator. The standards call for additions to be located away from primary building elevations, to be deferential to the original building in size, not to obscure distinctive historic features, and to be designed so as to be compatible with the historic building, while at the same time clearly differentiated as new construction. The National Park Service has numerous topical publications with guidance on interpreting the Secretary of the Interior standards that you and your design team can refer to when designing your rehabilitation. The completed Part 2 is submitted to the State Historic Preservation Office in Harrisburg. They will provide comments and forward your submission on to the National Park Service. NPS will invoice you for an application fee according to its fee schedule, which you can find on their website. The National Park Service conducts the final review and makes a decision. Your application will either be approved, This means your plans meet the Secretary of the Interior standards and you may get to work on your rehabilitation, but you should submit an amendment if your plans change. Approved with conditions. Your plans meet the standards with a few small modifications, or the Park Service wants to make clear that certain treatments must comply in certain ways. For example, if you're repointing masonry, that new mortar matches the old in color, composition, and the tooling of the joint. You may need to submit an amendment before beginning your project to show how you will meet certain conditions. Placed on hold for more information. This happens when your documentation, plans, and descriptions aren't thorough enough, or when you submit everything too soon before enough detail has been developed. If the National Park Service doesn't understand exactly what the building existing condition is, or your plans are too vague and they have questions, they will ask for more information and place your application on hold until they have what they need to complete the review. Denied. Your application will be denied if the plans do not substantially meet the Secretary of the Interior standards. Part 3 is submitted after the rehabilitation is complete and the building is placed in service. Like Parts 1 and 2, it has its own application cover sheet, and like Part 2, the National Park Service will invoice you for an application fee. The main component of Part 3 is photographs that go back around and through the building and completely document the finished project to show that you did exactly what you were approved to do. Once Part 3 is approved by the National Park Service, your rehabilitation is certified. You or your business entity can submit a copy of your certified Part 3 to the IRS along with Form 3468 investment credit to claim the historic rehabilitation tax credit on your income tax. The final topic I want to touch on briefly is that most states have a state historic tax credit as well. They're all different. Since I'm in Pennsylvania, I'm going to talk about Pennsylvania's. Pennsylvania's Historic Preservation Tax Credit is a partnership that is co-administered by the Pennsylvania State Historic Preservation Office and the Department of Community and Economic Development. SHPO reviews applications for technical compliance with applicable preservation regulations, and DCED awards the credits. The application is online through the state's single application for assistance. The application period is October 1st through 31st every year, and in past years the program has been first come, first served, so it's beneficial to apply early. I try to get my applications in on October 1st. The Pennsylvania program has a statewide cap of $20 million. At the time this presentation is being recorded, there is a per project cap of $500,000, but efforts are underway to have this raised to $1.5 million per project, so check the latest information when you apply. The program is designed to piggyback on the federal program, so if you have approved federal Parts 1 and 2, you can apply for the Pennsylvania state credit without duplicating submissions and reviews of all the same materials, plans, photographs, etc. You can just upload copies of the federal approvals. I will place a link to more information in the resources slide. These websites contain more detailed information about most of the topics I've introduced today. Again, please consult your State Historic Preservation Office, your experienced architect, your tax professional, and your legal counsel to make sure the Historic Rehabilitation Tax Credit Program is a good fit for you and your planned project. Thank you and good luck.
First, thank you, Angelique, for your presentation. I have a couple questions that may be beneficial to those watching, especially those who are brand new to the historic tax credit process. One question, could you give some more information about the timeframes for the reviews from the SHPO as well as the Park Service? If you submit a Part 2 application, when should you expect to hear back from SHPO and from Park Service, and will one follow the other?
Yes. So the regulatory review period is 30 days at each agency, which means, and the reviews are sequential to answer the last part of your question first. So we do submit each part of the application to SHPO first. SHPO takes care of the submission to the National Park Service. So once you have submitted to SHPO, it goes through the process from there, and SHPO orchestrates the rest of it. 30 days at each agency begins from when SHPO receives the application and is generally interpreted as 30 business days. Certain parts of the application are a bit more straightforward than others. So part one can be very straightforward. If the building is a contributing building to a National Historic District and you have demonstrated that in your part one application, then it's almost a rubber stamp and it shouldn't take 30 days to certify that historic structure, depending on the workload of the staff and how many things they have stacked up at their desk. So it's reasonable to expect that part one may not take a full 30 days at either SHPO or the National Park Service. Part two, again, is the most complex. Each building is different, each rehabilitation is different. If you have submitted a complete application that doesn't get put on hold for more information, 30 days is supposed to be the outside length of time before you will get a response from both SHPO and the National Park Service. Like all things in reality, it can take a little bit less time, it can take a little bit more time, and having your application put on hold for more information certainly lengthens the process. So also, like all things, it's advised to do the best job you can the first time with the first submission. Try to be as thorough as possible. SHPO staff is also available to meet and talk and discuss and answer questions and consult on certain aspects of the application, questions you may have, issues that you may want some advice in resolving. So they are a very helpful resource in preparing part two in terms of meeting the Secretary of the Interior standards. Their knowledge of other projects that have gone through the process can be really invaluable. So they can point to precedents of where a certain approach has been approved in the past and under what circumstances, or has not been approved, or has never been presented before. Part three is like part one, something that can take under 30 days at each agency to review. If you thoroughly document the project, it should be very clear to the reviewers that you have or have not done what you said you were going to do. And so it should be a pretty straightforward process to certify the rehabilitation with part three.
Two follow-ups to that. We talked about timeframes from SHPO and from Park Service. When the applicants get the comments, do they have a time frame to respond?
There really isn't an opportunity built into the process to respond to SHPO's comments. SHPO's comments are advisory to the National Park Service, and they can be a helpful sort of flag for applicants of what the National Park Service may have concerns about. But that is informational. Those comments are really informational for the applicant. The applicant is not required to respond to them. And again, there isn't even really a way built into the process for the applicant to respond to them. Once the National Park Service responds with its completed review and its comments, if the application is approved without any conditions, there's of course nothing to respond to. If the application is approved with conditions, then it can be helpful to check in with SHPO about whether or not those conditions require an amendment if it's not explicitly stated. So sometimes the response from the National Park Service will say, for example, the window replacement may be approved if X, Y, and Z conditions are met. Please submit this in an amendment. If that is not explicitly stated, then it can be helpful to, again, talk to SHPO about whether an amendment is advisable, just to make sure that box is checked before the project proceeds, because it's a lot easier, even if it's a pain to change things at that point in the process, it's certainly easier than to have to go back and reverse work at the end of the process, hearing that part three does not get approved.
And will SHPO staff, because they see these applications all the time, and like you mentioned, they're very knowledgeable, especially of what may and may not be approved based on what they've seen previously. Will SHPO staff ever come out to a site to visit to offer guidance?
Yes, occasionally they will make field trips, and what they try to do is bundle site visits to a number of properties and projects in a particular area when they come out to visit, say, Pittsburgh or Washington County. So yes, it's possible to get on their radar and invite them out for a site visit, and if they can do so, and especially if they can visit other sites at the same time, that may be something that can happen.
Okay. And just to clarify, you talked about Pennsylvania having a deadline for their applications, but on the federal side, there is no deadline per se, correct? You can submit
Correct.
applications at any time?
Yes, that's a rolling process at the federal level.
And also, like, unlike the state level, there is no cap on federal tax credit projects, correct? As far as
Yep,
throughout the
20%
country.
of the qualified rehabilitation expenses.
And for those who may have heard this before, several years ago, I just also want to clarify that there used to be a 10% federal tax credit for any buildings constructed before a certain date, and that date was sometime in the 30s. But that has completely gone away, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And this may be a little outside the scope, but could you talk anything about if somebody is looking to do a tax credit project for a building, but let's say this building, they also want to live in part of it. I'm thinking maybe like a bed and breakfast type thing where there would be rooms, but then there would also be residential place for the owner. Could you divide that space up to where certain areas or certain rooms are not part of the tax credit because they don't meet the qualifications? Or if you're trying to do a tax credit project for a building, it's an all or nothing situation?
It's not all or nothing. There definitely are and have been circumstances in which an owner plans to occupy part of the rehabilitation or part of the rehabilitated building as you described, and then the rest of the building is income producing property. So there are ways to address that within the process, yes.
Okay. And I think the final question I have is, somebody coming into this process with a historic building, they are not required to completely reconstruct the building as it was when it was constructed. So if pieces of the building had been previously removed, they don't need to completely reconstruct those elements, correct? And maybe you have some examples or an example of that.
Right. So you're correct. They do not need to reconstruct parts of the building that are currently missing. And in fact, a barrier to doing so may be that there is not adequate documentation of those missing building parts or pieces or features to reconstruct them with accuracy. And one thing that the Secretary of the Interior standards discourage is creating what it calls a false sense of history. So that would be putting back something that is kind of a guesstimate of something that might have been there. That is not something that the Secretary of the Interior standards encourage or that the Park Service would want to see. So in the case where there are features or elements missing from a historic building, if you have good documentation, of really clear photograph or even architectural plans of what it used to look like, that is something that you could work with should you want to replace that feature. But a lot of times we don't even have that. So it's better to come up with a different solution, which again will vary building by building, for how to address those absences without trying to reconstruct something that you don't have enough information about to do an accurate reconstruction job.
Okay, thank you. And those are all the questions I have that came to mind. So,
okay, those are good questions. Thanks.